Good morning. I had this morning the very difficult task of providing an overview of, and possibly an outlook of the future production cost or development cost of oil and gas. I will ask the question at the end of this presentation whether it really matters or not, and of course the situation, I think the answer will not be a simple one. First of all, I would like to give two elements to fully understand what I'm going to present. That I had the freedom to design this presentation, and I made two choices. The first one being that I'm going to consider jointly oil and gas for one reason, which is that even if as I mentioned in the previous panel, I do not subscribe to the view that there will be easy substitution of gas to oil. In other words, the continuum of resources on the demand side is much more limited than what is usually advertised. On the supply side, it makes complete sense. And oil companies, which were mostly purely oil companies until about 15 years ago, have been in the recent years developing towards gas very rapidly, and today most oil companies are in fact both oil and gas companies, if not more gas companies than oil companies. So it makes complete sense to study jointly oil and gas. Second point is that I'm going to concentrate on conventional projects rather than non-conventional for the following reason. Even if non-conventional projects in the recent years have brought almost the entire growth of those markets, conventional oil and gas still represent the vast majority of those markets. This is very visible on the oil market. Most growth which has taken place in the last 5 years comes from oil sands, comes from biofuels, for example, but conventional oil today still represent about 90% of the actual market. So I will consequently refer to average cost rather than marginal cost, and I'm going to, and I have to give the precision, the following precision, which is that my distinction of conventional and non-conventional refers to the type of reservoirs. In other words, inside non-conventional, I include tight reservoirs, shale oil and gas reservoirs, and oil sands. So all this is excluded from my presentation, and I include all the other types of resources and fields, including all offshore resources, whatever the water depth. And this is an important point. Here I include all resources located offshore. This being said, I'm going to start this presentation by outlining the fact that it is now well known that capital expenditure have been increasing very fast over the last 10 years. And this has been driven by developments both onshore and offshore. But this is raising the question of what are the main variables driving this trend. The first element of answer is a possible volume effect. In other words, does this strong increase of capital expenditures over the last 10 years driven by a significant increase of volumes of reserves developed? The answer is mostly no. In other words, you have on this graph the 3 last cycles of the oil industry. The first one started at the end of the 70s and until the counter-oil shock of 1985-1986, when driven by the significant oil price increase, the oil industry developed significant amount of reserves let's say on average, about 70 to 80 billion barrels of oil equivalent. But this was significantly reduced following the counter oil shock of '86, and then the industry entered a period of much lower activity until 1977-78, when the volume of reserves developed was, by comparison, much lower. Of course, the main factors explaining this drop in activity comes from the fact that in those years, spare capacities were extremely high, the price was quite low, and there was absolutely no incentive, especially in the context of the collapse of the USSR, to develop much reserves to respond to demand. Things have changed at the end of the 90s, and driven in fact by the squeeze of spare capacities appearing at the beginning of the decade 2000, there has been a rebound of oil and gas activity. And today we are back to what was the average level at the beginning of the 80s. So on average, we develop about 70 to 80 billion barrels of oil equivalent every year. This shows that although the overall level of activity is quite significant compared to the previous cycle, there is by itself, there is no significant increase, especially over the last years, which could explain the strong increase of capital expenditures. The explanation of this strong increase of capex comes from the fact that unit cost, production cost per barrel of oil equivalent, have increased a lot starting from 2005. Here, I again need to provide a few explanations. The absolute values will be, for those familiar with the subject, will be a bit surprising. In other words, usually the actual values of development costs for oil and gas projects would be more in the range of $5 to $10 per barrel developed. In fact, here the estimate is lower simply because I excluded from my analysis the capex which are spent a long time after production is actually starting. In other words, I did not take into account the complete cost of projects at the time of production is starting, simply to avoid making an implicit assumption on the actual cost inflation or cost deflation. And here, the main point is more in the trend rather than the absolute values. In order to get a flavor of what would be the actual absolute values, you have, roughly speaking, to multiply by 2 the numbers which appear on this graph. Now, it's really obvious that the cost inflation measured at the unit cost per developed barrel is affecting both onshore and offshore resources, and it seems that in roughly the same proportion. And of course, it appears that the origin of this cost inflation lies somewhere else, and I'm going to try now to share with you my view of what has been driven this cost inflation visible in the cost per developed barrel. I think there are 3 main components in the development cost. The first one refers to everything related to the oil and gas services industry. In other words, engineering and construction capacities, availability of human resources, and of course the purely technological factor on which I will elaborate further. The second main component, fundamental variable affecting the development cost, is related to geology. In other words, everything else being equal, the field size, the location of the field, whether it is easily accessible or not, the water depth for offshore projects are the main variables which explain how the cost is going to be affected by the conditions of development. And finally, we also, of course, need to take into account the political and legal context. And this includes different factors, of course, direct fiscal regimes, which are applied by producing countries. One issue which appeared recently, which refers to the local content requirements which are demanded by some producing countries, and the issue of state control, which does not necessarily translate into the fiscal regimes, but which may impact, sometimes importantly, the final development cost. I refer here, I hope it is visible, yes. I refer here to the last quarter of century, in fact starting from 1985, 1986, when the oil market really started its current organization based on, basically, generally speaking, the principles of a free market economy. So over the last quarter of century, we have basically two periods of time. The first one, from 85 until the end of the 90s, was characterized by, as I said, a high level of spare capacity, low price, very low incentive to develop new reserves. And we can say that, generally speaking, geology and the political, legal context of this period of time played only moderate cost impact increase. Sorry. In other words, the fundamental aspects, the fundamental variables with which the oil industry had to deal over this period of time on the geological side contributed to a moderate cost increase, mainly driven by the fact that at this time the industry had to orient itself to fields which would be, basically speaking, slightly more or slightly less accessible than it was in the past. And this is the time also when offshore developments really started to develop. And as such, those variables made a contribution as a moderate cost increase. On the side of oil services industry, technology and innovation at this period of time played a very positive role in moderating the evolution of production cost. This is a time when there has been numerous innovations, but the strong cost decrease impact was also amplified by the fact that at this time there were excess also spare capacities for engineering and construction capacities, and there was an excess of human resources compared to the situation which is now currently on those industries. So basically speaking, from 1985 to 2000, the general evolution of cost has been slightly driven upward by the geological context and the political context, but it has been driven downward by the situation of the oil industry services. The situation changed radically about a bit more than 10 years ago. 10 years ago, even if on the geological side the situation remained roughly the same, no radical change in terms of field size developed, no radical change in terms of difficulty in terms of field location, no radical change in terms of water depth. There has been a radical change in terms of capacity of industry services to supply what the industry was asking for. And even if technology and innovation still played a very important role in moderating cost, generally speaking, there has been a huge squeeze on engineering and construction capacities, which is in fact the main factor which is behind the general cost inflation, which affected both onshore and offshore projects. On the political and legal context dimension, there has been the beginning of a turn. Fiscal regimes did not change so much. There has been rather stability of this variable. But the state control began to be stricter, to be closer, and as such, it was visible in some, of course, producing countries, and as such, it also contributed to the general evolution of the cost. So this is a very schematic view of the main variables affecting, which have been affected production cost over the last 20, 25 years. It doesn't tell anything about what is going to happen now in the future, and of course this is my task to share with you some elements which I think will shape the future evolution of cost. The first element, in order to illustrate this possible, the future evolution of production cost, lies in the fact that even if the global level of developed reserves is quite high and back to what have been the level of activity of the industry almost 30 years ago, there has been a significant change in the types of fields which have been developed. And this is even more visible on this graph as I show something looking like the market share of the fields developed based on their location. So you can see that two trends are apparent, especially over the last 10 years. The first one is that the trend of onshore and offshore developments is showing that if onshore fields were representing about 70% of developed reserves about 30 years ago, we are now back to about 50%. So 50% of the fields developed today are located onshore, and this trend is declining. Inside offshore fields, the same trend is appearing between shallow offshore and deep and ultra-deep offshore. And if offshore at water depth greater than 1,000 meters were really confidential and really only starting about 15 years ago, today those fields represent about 10% of the reserves developed. And this is, as such, an element which is contributing to cost increase, and we will see later that this is a trend which will be very difficult to counterbalance. The implication of this trend is the following. On the upper left graph, you have a calculation of what is the actual average water depth for offshore developments. And water depth weighted by reserves in order to give a reliable picture. You can see that we are on an increasing trend of offshore developments in terms of water depth. Today, we are now closer and even higher than 600 meters. So overall, in the world, oil and gas offshore projects are now reaching, on average, 600 meters. And the trend is a long-term increasing trend, but it seems that it has started to accelerate over the last years. As such, this is, everything else equal, this is a factor driving production costs, of course, higher. But we have to look at what has been in terms of technology, what has allowed to increase the water depth of offshore developments. On the upper right graph, you can see that offshore developments in shallow waters, let's say at less than 300-meter water depth, from fixed platforms, did not change, is really fairly stable. In other words, on average, fixed platforms are still providing developments for water depth around 100 meters. And this is a flat trend. This does not move. Well, of course, for obviously physical reasons, fixed platforms do not allow to develop reserves at higher water depth. And in fact, the long-term trend of increasing water depth for offshore developments comes from the development of new technologies, namely everything looking like floating infrastructures and more recently subsea infrastructures. Historically, floating infrastructures really started to generalize, let's say, at the beginning of the 90s. So this is the first innovation which has allowed the oil industry to go to develop deeper oil and gas fields. And we can see that today, on average, floating infrastructures are developing fields which are about at 1,200 meter water depth. But as such, this has not been enough, and this is really the recent development of subsea infrastructures which allowed the industry to go and develop a wider range of fields at increasing also water depth. So we have here two opposite trends. The first one is that developing oil and gas fields at increasing water depth is, everything else being equal, a strong factor of cost increase. On the other side, the generalization of floating and subsea infrastructures is, as we are going to see it now, a factor of cost moderation. Let's say this is the good aspect, and this is the moderating impact on cost of new technologies. If I decompose the graph I show you, showing onshore and offshore fields, on average, if I decompose the offshore trend between the three different components, the three main technologies, fixed platform, floaters, and subsea infrastructures, we can see that all of them have been affected roughly by the same rate. In other words, the cost inflation, which was mainly driven by the squeeze over the last 10 years in oil services industries, has been affecting all types of development. But we can see two things. The first one is that at any time, we keep the hierarchy of development cost between fixed, floater, and subsea developments. And this is consistent with the fact that fixed developments or fixed platforms are for developments in shallow waters, so in moderately difficult conditions. Floaters manage to go deeper but at a higher cost. And subsea infrastructures manage to go even deeper and in even more challenging conditions, but also at a higher cost. So we show here, what is shown here on this graph, is that there is a consistency of the fact that the deeper we go, the higher the cost, but there is no proportionate effect between the water depth and the development cost. In other words, the ratio between the development cost of between fixed and floater, between floater and subsea, is not proportionate to the actual gain in terms of water depth. The second element I want to outline is that very recently, over the last 3 years, there appears to be some kind of a plateau of development cost, especially for the most for the highest technological content development, offshore development, subsea and floaters are showing some kind of stabilization of the development cost, even though we are reaching deeper water depths for those developments. One element of answer lies into the fact that over the last 5 to 6 years, there seems to be a trend that offshore developments are going deeper thanks to floating and subsea infrastructures, and they are also going bigger in terms of size of the fields developed. And this is, as such, an element of cost moderation. In other words, this is leading to strong increase of actual absolute capex, capital expenditures, but in terms of cost per barrel, this is a moderating factor. The bigger the fields developed, the lower the actual cost per barrel developed and produced. So as such, there is, for water depth greater than 1,000 meters, at the moment, a stabilizing effect on the production cost, which comes from the fact that big fields are developed at increasing water depth. It is striking that by comparing the development cost with the different technologies, the increasing cost effect of increasing water depth has been mitigating by the effect of technology and, as I mentioned just before, the effect of developing bigger fields, everything else being equal. And you have on those graphs the estimates of the development cost per barrel for each type of infrastructure, but also for different size of fields. So you have estimates of development cost for fields around 50 million barrels of oil equivalent, 200, 500, and 1,000, 1 billion barrels of oil equivalent. And what is striking is that even though floating infrastructures and subsea infrastructures go and develop big fields in very challenging conditions at increasing water depth, the development cost per barrel is not significantly different than the cost of developing barrels in shallow waters using fixed platforms. And as such, this is a demonstration of what technology has achieved over the recent years. Of course, the cost inflation has affected all segments of the industry, but there has been a very moderating effect of technology which contributed to unlock reserves which in the past could not be developed. As such, and here I show exactly the same data, but using a different framework. I show not the type of infrastructure which are used for the developments, but the average cost per barrel for different field sizes at different, let's say for the three main water depth categories, lower than 300 meters, between 300 and 1,000 meters, and beyond 1,000 meters. What is, again, striking is that the development of subsea infrastructures has allowed to monitor and to control the cost at increasing water depth. As such, this is a reason to believe that even though more and more barrels are developed offshore, the cost increase will not be necessarily as explosive as one may think, but this is only one preliminary element of conclusion which needs additional information. Because now the situation and the question which is asked is the following. We can see that the cost inflation was mainly driven in the last 20, 25 years by, in fact, the cyclical situation of industry services, but this is only cyclical. The main question is how this situation is going to evolve and to combine with the more fundamental variables that the oil industry has to deal with and which I'm now going to illustrate. I'm now showing not the volumes of oil and gas developed, but the volume of oil and gas discovered over the same period of time. And what has been visible for developed reserves is even more pronounced for discovered reserves. In other words, even if onshore and offshore tends to be roughly in the same proportion, we can see that newly discovered reserves are more and more located in deep and ultra-deep offshore. And as such, this is a very strong trend which is illustrating two facts which deserve to be mentioned. The first one is that, again, those discoveries were made possible by the strong evolution of technology over the last 10, 15 years. This is the first point. The second point is that those discoveries in deep and ultra-deep offshore are the result of the degree of maturity of onshore and shallow offshore oil and gas plays. In other words, oil and gas companies are now turning, especially over the last 10 years, to increasing water depth simply because the prospects and the possibilities of making new significant discoveries onshore and in shallow offshore have been basically dropping. So this is showing the long-term trend of the oil and gas industry, tackling and developing, discovering, tackling and developing more and more reserves in more challenging situations at increasing water depth. So everything else being equal, we have here a very strong point of increasing cost increase over the future. One more point. This is even more visible on this graph, which is really showing that the trend of deep and ultra-deep offshore reserves discovered is now accelerating. And again, this is not only the result of technology, this is also the result that discoveries are dropping in onshore and shallow offshore basins.
A few more minutes, Olivier, if that's okay.
A few moments?
Yes.
Okay, I try everything possible. The main point I want to outline here is the following. In addition to all those elements, I wish to bring your attention to the following fact: the number of discovered fields. On the left-hand side graph, you can see that the number of fields discovered is showing a declining trend for onshore fields, for shallow offshore, and moderately increasing at increasing water depth. You can see that currently we discover, or let's say we, not we, the oil and gas industry discover about 150 fields onshore, about a bit more than 50 fields in shallow offshore, and this is roughly the level of activity of the industry over the last 10 years. In other words, there is one factor which is playing an increasing effect on the production cost, although this is indirect, not direct, which is the fact that basically the oil and gas industry today is discovering every year what it needs to develop every year. So everything else being equal, this is reducing the time lag which is allowed between discovery and development. This is not a factor of strong price cost increase as such, but this is contributing to the pressure which is exercised by oil and gas companies on oil industry services companies. And this is contributing to the overall trend of cost inflation on the side of oil services. Forgive me, I'm going to drop this slide and to go directly to some elements of conclusion. I want to outline one parameter which I'm sure will be very surprising for most of you, if not all of you. But I want to outline something. I mentioned the fact that oil and gas production costs are mostly explained by technical factors. This is related to the cost inflation of industry services. By geological factors, field sizes, field locations, water depth, and production costs are also influenced by parameters linked to the political and legal context of producing countries. This is visible in the fiscal regimes. This is visible in the degree of control of producing countries. This is also visible very recently in the requirements of local content for development of domestic resources. We have an increasing number of examples: Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, Vietnam, and a few others. And I want now to get rid of, or to begin to start to get rid of let's say, one concept which is in my view is nonsense, which is resource nationalism. Resource nationalism is an empty concept which does not explain anything, and which does not explain that more and more producing countries are exercising increasing control and power over their own industry and over the development of their domestic resources. And this, sorry, it's going to take me a few more minutes, relates not to politics, it does not relate to religion, it does not relate to, I don't know what are the variables, it relates to anthropology. And I present you here a very brief, very global representation of the world, not based on languages, not based on religion, but based on the characteristics of the anthropological models of the different populations of the world. And basically speaking, generally speaking, there are two types of population in the world. The populations which have a very strong control over common goods, and the populations which have on the opposite, moderate, low control, or even in some cases no control at all on common goods. In other words, this relates to how families in different populations own, manage, and give the property of the patrimony of the common goods belonging to the family to the following generations. And this is showing that not all populations in the world share the same values and the same system in defining the property of the common goods and defining the way those goods belonging to individuals, belonging to families, are going to be transmitted to the next generation. These would require further explanations, and I think most of you will raise their eyebrows in front of these representations. But this is a way of also challenging a concept which has emerged over the last 10 years, which is this concept of MENA countries, Middle East, North African countries, which are given the same name, belonging to the same group, simply because, in most cases, they exercise a very strong control over domestic resources, if not full monopoly. They are opposed to flows of international investments, and, by coincidence, they show to be, in most cases, but not always, Muslim countries. And in fact, MENA country, the concept of MENA countries, does not explain anything and is quite dangerous because it gives the impression that those countries should necessarily share with the other countries, and especially importing countries, the same system of values which lead to free access to domestic resources. And this is absolutely wrong. This is absolutely wrong. I would take two opposite examples. Historically, the development of the oil and gas industry was born in the United States. In the US, like in England, like in Netherlands, the organization of the population gives absolutely priority to the individual initiative, the freedom to act, the freedom to take an initiative. It's absolutely central to the way the society and the way families are structured. By extension, this explains why the oil and gas industry was born in the US, because it was the result of multiple initiatives at a very local level, but this translated into a high flow of initiatives, and finally it gave birth to the oil and gas industry at the beginning of the 20th century. This was made possible simply because individuals in the US, in England, also in the Netherlands, is given the priority compared to the community. By opposition, let's take the example of Middle East countries and maybe, for example, Saudi Arabia. The value system is completely opposite. The priority is not given to the individual, it is given to the community. And the community should take decisions for the benefit of all its members in a very egalitarian view, not to disseminate the patrimony of the family outside of the family. And of course, there's no surprise that these values, this system, gave birth to a way of exploiting natural resources which is completely opposite, which is giving the monopoly to one power, one single power, which is acting over the long term in the benefit of all the members of the community. The individual has no right in this system. If we ignore those differences of values, those differences of how to exploit and how to own natural resources, we are not going to understand why there will be a strong opposition today already, and of course in the future, around oil and gas resources. If we have a misconception of the equilibrium of forces and the confrontation of different systems, I fear that we are going to take wrong decisions. And why so? Simply because if I make a breakdown of oil and gas reserves today between populations showing a very strong control over resources and population showing no real interest or showing a low control over natural resources, we can see that liquids in conventional reservoirs are located up to 85% in countries exercising a strong control over resources. The same for gas from conventional reservoirs. And generally speaking, at the world level, we can see that the vast majority of hydrocarbon reserves are located in places where people do not share the system of individual initiative and individual enterprise in order to develop rapidly and in a free manner those reserves. If we ignore those facts, I fear that there will be wrong decisions both in international relations and also sometimes inside the oil and gas industry. Finally, and this is my final slide, my conclusion, I think after a very strong cost inflation in the last 10 years, I think there will be a moderation of cost in the next 10 years and even in the next 20 years. Why? Simply because if the geological factors are pushing costs upwards, due to the reducing size of fields, due to the increasing difficulty of developing new fields, especially in offshore basins. I think that there will be a moderation of cost on the size of oil services industry. There has been a cycle of tension. I think this cycle is going to ease simply because this is the result of industrial choices on which there is no strong constraint over the long term. I think more and more people will work in oil industry services, will bring more competence, and this as such will be a strong factor of moderating cost. Concerning the political and legal context, I think we will keep this moderately cost increase, although the level of state control is probably going to increase. But of course, this will not necessarily translate into increasing and tightening fiscal regimes. Finally, I want, because I am myself under pressure, I want to go back to the first question I wanted to ask to you and to myself. Do this review and outlook for production cost is going to really matter in the next years and next decade? Yes and no. I think no, for the following reasons, that whatever the developments, especially of oil over the next years, these are probably going to prove insufficient to face the evolution of demand. As such, we are going to see, we are already seeing, a change in the price regime, specifically of oil, which is not driven by the production cost, but which is driven by the user value. In other words, the price we reached in 2008 at almost $150 per barrel was already the sign that the price of oil will be driven much more by what the consumer is ready to pay for it, rather than what the producer is spending to bring this barrel of oil. So as such, I would say that even if production costs are setting the long-term trend of the oil and gas prices, this is probably going to be insufficient to keep the evolution of price, especially the price of oil, under control, and the price of oil is already starting to disconnect from the production cost. Now, the evolution of production cost is important, and yes, it does matter for the following reason. This is going to impact the profitability of the overall oil and gas sector, not only oil and gas companies, but also the industry services. And as such, it should not be forgotten, as Robert Hirsch mentioned it this morning, that it is probably a mistake to assume that the energy transition will be developed against or without the entire oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector will and is already taking its part in this energy transition. Investments in synthetic liquid fuels, in some renewable technologies is already taking place, and it would be a mistake to ignore what the oil and gas sector will bring in the future to this energy transition. I think there is no contradiction between the idea and the necessity of the energy transition and the fact that the entire oil and gas sector will take its part in this long-term move. Thank you.
Thank you.